समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
The oldest part of the story is the only one we can be reasonably sure of. Late in the 14th century, the great-great-great-grandson of the Mongol nobleman Sayyid Ajmal Shams ad-Din Omar was captured in the Great War raging across the province of Yunnan. Less than 14 years old, he was castrated and sent to serve in the palace of the Ming invaders. There he became friend to Zhu Di, the son of the Ming dynasty's founder. Later, in 1399, when Zhu Di launched a coup against his nephew, the Emperor Jian Wen, the palace eunuch would rise to a great place in history. Zheng He, his Chinese name was, Grand Admiral Zheng He, leader of at least 7 great voyages that stretched from the shores of the Middle Kingdom, through the islands of Southeast Asia to India, Sri Lanka, past the Persian Gulf and Yemen, and all the way to southern Africa. Fantastic as the story is, it likely wouldn't be of much interest to anyone except historians, bookworms, and the odd social misfit who prefers the lashing winds of the monsoon to the gentle breeze of air conditioning. The thing is though, the story holds the keys to understand the great maritime contest that's being fought between China and its East Asian neighbors. The headlines ever since President Donald Trump took power in America have been dominated by what he's doing in Ukraine and what it might mean for Europe and the world. There's an even bigger story though that's about to unfold in Asia, which will potentially be of much more significance for India. Trump is expected to soon attend a meeting of leaders of the Quad Alliance or grouping, which is to be hosted by India. There will be a great deal of attention on what he will or won't commit to doing to push back against the PLA's growing aggression in the South China Sea. Welcome to this issue of the Prince Explorer series. First up, I'd like to take a moment to make an appeal. Those of you who regularly watch this program, as well as the Print's news and analytical offerings, come here because of the deep granular research we offer, as well as our unrivaled on-ground coverage. Keeping this going though needs resources, and to keep on producing the content we do, we need you to support us through subscriptions. So please consider subscribing to The Print if you haven't already done so. Subscribers get an ad-light viewing experience, access to special newsletters, Ask Me Anything one-on-one sessions with senior editors, as well as an opportunity to join in the debate and publish your opinions on our Your Turn pages. And now I'll get back to the strange story of what a 14th century eunuch admiral has to do with what could prove to be the most important conflict in what many now see as an inevitable new Cold War. Last summer, a Philippines naval vessel began one of the most bizarre regular missions that takes place anywhere in the world. To resupply a group of sailors who live on a wrecked World War II warship that is beached on a coral reef on the Second Thomas Shoal, 194 kilometers from the island of Palawan in the Philippines. In 1999, the Philippines deliberately breached the craft, the BRP Sierra Madre, to assert its territorial claims to the reef and a wider territory in what it calls the West Philippine Sea. Ever since then, the Philippines had staged regular resupply missions to the beached ship. But this time, as we'll see, the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, had other ideas. The dispute had, scholar Christopher Joyner has written in a very thorough account, begun in February 1995, when the PLA built 3 octagonal structures perched on stilts above what is now called Mischief Reef. The Philippines protested and things seemed to calm down for a while. But in October 1998, the PLA dispatched at least 4 military ships and about 100 workers to resume construction. Ever since decolonization, these waters had been disputed. 8 states, no less, claimed title to the islands in the South China Sea. Singapore and Malaysia dispute each other's claims over Pisang Island and Pulau Batu Puteh, strategically located in the Malacca Straits. Taiwan and Vietnam contest each other's sovereignty over the Paracel Islands, which is a group of 15 little islands and several reefs and shoals in the middle of the Gulf of Tonkin. Taiwan contests China's claims to Pratas Islands and the Macclesfield Bank. As for the Spratlys, 6 nation-states assert claims. China, Taiwan, Vietnam claim the entire archipelago, while the Philippines, Malaysia and Brunei claim sovereignty over portions of the Spratlys. Except for Brunei, all the others have established some kind of military presence in the Spratlys. Things began to heat up at the end of the 1980s. The first such clash came on the 8th of February 1987 when Chinese and Vietnamese warships opened fire on each other in the area. Then, an even more serious confrontation occurred off Union Reef as each navy lost a vessel and 120 Vietnamese sailors drowned. The biggest fighting came in March 1988 after a small contingent of Vietnamese opened fire on Chinese construction personnel. China dispatched warships and 3 Vietnamese vessels were sunk. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Nations, mounted considerable diplomatic pressure on China to ease up, which seemed to pay off for a time. But then, Chinese construction activity resumed. The Philippines decided it had no choice but to assert its rights in kind, which is why that ship was deliberately beached. Last year, though, the status quo threatened to fall apart. Chinese Coast Guard officers forcibly boarded the Philippine rubber boat attempting to resupply the ship and punctured it with knives and sharp-ended rods. They looted 7 disassembled rifles being ferried to the soldiers and destroyed outboard motors, communication sets, and navigational equipment. Through the attack, the Chinese personnel deployed strobe lights, sirens, and tear gas to disorient the Philippine sailors. A Philippines naval serviceman lost his thumb when the rubber boat was rammed. For Indian audiences, some of this will probably seem similar because, of course, it's exactly like the pushing and shoving that we've seen taking place when PLA patrols brush up against the Indian Army along the line of actual control. Like it does on the LAC, the PLA sought to keep the conflict just short of the threshold of actual battle by avoiding the use of firearms. Like Galwan did though, the clash at the Second Thomas Shoal could easily have turned far more serious. After all, there's no way of guaranteeing that pushing, shoving, fighting sailors won't be drowned or that fires won't break out or someone won't open fire. Things have gone downhill since that incident. In December, Chinese Coast Guard ships fired water cannon and rammed a ship from the Philippines Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, which is tasked with surveying and securing Philippine fishery in the country's economic zone, exclusive economic zone. Last month, Chinese Coast Guard helicopters and ships harried Philippines vessels off Sandy Cay, a group of 3 small uninhabited sandbars flanked by an artificial island base of Chinese forces and a Philippines-occupied island. Even more dangerous, PLA combat aircraft have been bumping up against air patrols sent out by the Philippines and its security allies, Australia and the United States. The world and international law recognizes that all countries have a right of passage through these waters. And to concede China the right to impose airspace restrictions would be a threat to the international community and norms as a whole. The question many will be asking though ahead of the coming Quad summit is, will Donald Trump back up countries like the Philippines if push comes to shove? Or will he sell them down the river like he seems to have done with Ukraine? Like so much else to do with nationalism in the world, the battle over these islands and reefs has less to do with the oil and gas that's under the waters and something to do with the ways in which nations imagine themselves. Long before the revolution that birthed the People's Republic of China and before anyone knew about oil and gas reserves in these waters, China's previous Kuomintang government issued maps with what was called the 11-line. The 11-line basically claimed the Spratly and Paracel island chains as its own. Taiwan forces still maintain a garrison on the largest of the islands of the Spratlys, Taiping. Following the revolution, the People's Republic ceded Bailongwei Island to what was then North Vietnam at the height of their bromance against the West, and later issued a new map. That new map is now what is called the 9-line, or China's maritime boundaries. In 1914, a continuous boundary line enclosing part of the South China Sea along with the two island groups had first appeared in Chinese National Atlas, which was compiled by two private cartographers, not the government. No later than 1935, the boundary line was extended, again by private cartographers, to include the four island groups in the South China Sea. Scholars Shikuo Gao and Bing Bingjia record. Then in January 1935, a Chinese government-appointed commission, remember this was pre-revolutionary, was established to examine maps and atlases produced by private sources in China. This published a list of 132 names in both English and Chinese for islands and other features in the South China Sea. In April 1935, the Commission's Gazette published an atlas of the islands in the South China Sea. Listen to certain kinds of Chinese nationalists and they'll try and convince you that the 9-line is based on China's historical reach and presence in the oceans. This isn't, it's important to understand, pure fantasy. China was indeed a great seafaring power of antiquity. The Canigdo map made by two Korean cartographers in 1402, yes, at exactly the same time the eunuch Grand Admiral was beginning his great voyages, show us the world traversed by Chinese maritimers. The Spratlys were indeed a part of it, a very small part. Like so many pre-modern maps though, the Canigdo map describes known regions and routes, places maritimers went to. The medieval world simply did not comprehend or obsess over territorial sovereignty in the way we now do. The famous map of Fra Mauro, made by an Italian in 1450, not very much after the Canigdo map, suggests European sailors were aware of an equally large, in fact much larger world than the Chinese. Let's take a specific example. There's plenty of reason to believe Admiral Zheng He landed in Palawan, the Philippines province closest to the disputed reef. He may even have had a role in setting up a Muslim settlement there. There are maps from the 18th century though showing new powers, in this case the Spanish, were claiming sovereignty over the Spratlys too. Indeed, these maps call the Philippines New Castile, after the Spanish kingdom. The fact that Spain controlled the region can't be the basis for a territorial claim by Madrid today, or there would be no end to claims and counterclaims in the world. There is no disputing that Zheng He's expeditions did project a kind of proto-colonial power across the region, just as the Spanish and subsequent conquerors were to do. In 1403, the Fujian Regional Military Commission was ordered to build 137 ocean-going ships. In 1405, just after Zheng He departed on his first expedition, Zhejiang and other regional military commissions were ordered to build 1,180 ocean-going ships. By 1408, the task was assigned to a central ministry, and the Ministry of Works was required to build 48 large ships. Each individual mission by Zheng He made up to 250 large ships and involved tens of thousands of naval personnel. In other episodes of ThePrint Security Code and The Explorer, you can find references to these great expeditions which went all the way to Sri Lanka and further west, sorting out various unruly pirates and troublesome kings along the way. The expeditions, though, traversed routes that were well known to the medieval world as a whole, not just the Chinese. The navigators who guided Zheng He were often Arabs or Indians, well versed with ocean currents and winds, having long guided merchant ships through these seas. The so-called Silk Road on the sea was first used in the Qin and Han dynasties and flourished in popularity in the Tang and Song dynasties. This maritime route of trade and commerce not only preceded its counterpart on land, but also extended further to reach the northern shores of the Mediterranean. It may well be the most enduring maritime trade route in history. Late Ming and early Qing emperors were ultimately to issue a ban on maritime trade between 1474 and 1551, for a variety of reasons, one of which was that they just didn't see point to investing so much wealth in securing routes that they didn't need to physically occupy and protect. After the First Opium War broke out between China and Great Britain in 1840, another story altogether, the Silk Road on the sea fell into disuse. Today, modern China sees its projection of power as bringing that historic Chinese power back into play in the world. Now, were the Chinese a great maritime power? Yes. But were they sovereigns and overlords of maritime Asia? No. And then, the most important question we need to ask, does it matter? The Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, which ruled on the conflict in the South China Seas in 2016 on an application from the Philippines, went into length on China's historical claims to control the region. Though China claimed a constellation of historical rights to the South China Seas, the court held, these historical rights fell short of proving that it had historical title to these waters, that is, actual sovereignty over these waters. The United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea, or UNCLOS, the court noted, wasn't very interested in these historical rights anyway. It laid out very specific technical criteria to decide on what maritime nations could be claimed by one country or the other as their exclusive economic zone. The court ended up ruling in favor of the Philippines on almost every count based on careful study of the technical mandates of UNCLOS. Then, after that decisive court judgment, things got worse. From after the judgment, China stepped up its efforts to reclaim land in the South China Sea by physically increasing the size of islands or creating new ones altogether. In addition to piling sand up onto existing reefs, China has constructed ports, military installations and airstrips, particularly in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, where it has 20 and 7 outposts respectively. China has militarized Woody Island by deploying fighter jets, cruise missiles and a radar system. The country flatly rejects the UNCLOS Arbitration Award, even though it's a signatory to that judgment. The United States has condemned China for rejecting that award, but isn't a signatory to the convention. The Philippines scholar Curtis Simpson and his colleagues have shown in a very interesting paper has used novel tactics to take on China's grey zone warfare in the South China Sea. Grey zone meaning the space between outright conventional force and peaceful competition. The Philippines has responded by inflicting reputational damage on China. It's done this by pursuing a strategy of transparency very creatively. Manila regularly disseminates raw footage and promotes independent reporting to expose dangerous Coast Guard and maritime militia actions of the Chinese at sea. This approach aims to garner domestic and international support for the Philippines' stance against China. Even though this put sunlight on the situation strategy hasn't deterred China, it's probably pushed the PLA in Beijing to move much more cautiously than they might otherwise have done. The Philippines are in no position, obviously, to compete with China economically or militarily. They are entirely reliant on support from the United States and, to a lesser extent, Australia. But China values its reputation as a savior of the so-called Third World. And the kinds of media strategies the Philippines is pursuing do cause it embarrassment. What China does on the little reefs in the Spratlys will ultimately depend, though, on what Trump brings to the table at the Quad Summit in India. The fate of one little reef, of course, hangs in the balance, but with the fate of that reef is tied the fate of nations and the balance of power across Asia. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a consulting editor with ThePrint. Thank you for joining this episode of The Print Explorer.